to Cape Horn. It will be a long time before Arnold and I forget that one. You know Arnold, of course, if you've seen the first picture, Rough Road to Panama. It tells the first half of this story you will now see, an attempted automobile trip from Washington, D.C. to Cape Horn. Rough Road to Panama tells the story as far south as the Panama Canal. Now, in this picture, we begin there and continue the unforgettable trek down the Andes all the way to Cape Horn. If you haven't seen the first film, do so as soon as possible. It will help you understand what is back of the story you now see. The route of this present film takes us from Buenaventura here, where we have landed from a boat which brought us down from the Panama Canal, then on up to Bogota, the capital of Colombia, and south again through Quito, Ecuador, through Lima, Peru, and down to Arequipa. Then we climb the Andes, 16,000 feet in the sky, and cross Bolivia's desolate uplands and on down here to Buenos Aires. Then we follow south through Patagonia's seemingly limitless pampa to Magellan Straits and this Chilean city of Magallanes. And then, as guests of the Chilean Navy, on out to Cape Horn in a storm. To dramatize the route a little, here is approximately what it looks like in vertical measurements. Only even this is tame substitute for seeing it firsthand. These high peaks are not peaks of the mountains. They are altitudes of the actual passes over which you climb in your car, with plenty more canyon valleys and high ridges not shown in between. This map shows only the principal elevations. The geography of South America is perhaps the most dominating aspect of this part of the Western Hemisphere. In fact, it is difficult to imagine greater extremes of magnitude in any one continent of the world than are found here. First are these high reaches of the Andes, almost unbelievable to one who has not known great mountains by personal contact. Several of the high peaks of Earth are here: Aconcagua, Ojos de Salado, Chimborazo, and many others. North America just isn't in it for heights and depths compared to her southern neighbor. Then comes the great desert of Peru and Chile, some 3,000 miles long by car, where you drive 75 to 100 miles and never see a drop of water or a piece of pulp that ever grew, where you simmer in the heat in the day, and where you freeze in the cold at night, where you swear that desert sand is stacked 5, 6, and 7,000 feet high against the blue snow-dotted spine of the Andes in the background. Next is the remarkable beauty of the lake and channel country of southern Chile and Tierra del Fuego, as majestic and inspiring as any country in the world, and as desolate. Great peaks rise from frighteningly narrow and deep channels of cold sea, glaciers, ice caps, and Antarctic storms. Then back up the eastern side of the continent come the vast stretches of Patagonian Pampa I mentioned a moment ago, where great herds of sheep graze with the wild and easily frightened guanacos, and where ostriches roam, unmolested for the most part, except for the storybook gauchos who run them down by throwing bolos around their necks, weighting their heads to the ground. Then on north from Argentina into the vast jungles of Paraguay, eastern Bolivia, Brazil, and Venezuela, jungles some of which still remain unentered by white men. And the tremendous spread of the Amazon, the greatest river in the world, so wide it looks like a flowing ocean, whose waters travel 4,000 miles to reach the sea, whose dangers to navigation in its many streams are small compared to those lurking in the uncharted jungles that crowd its shores from the Andes to the Atlantic hump. These vast physical characteristics of the continent form such tremendous barriers to road building, transportation, and economic development as are difficult to understand by a people who never see them. But after you've crawled over, swept through, and shivered in as much South American geography as have Arnold and I, you develop a very healthy respect for the continent. It wasn't until I tried to push our car up a 25% grade, nearly 3 miles in the air down there, that I found out how puny I was compared to the slow, paralyzing effect of rarefied atmosphere and the greatness around me. But it's good for a man's soul to be deflated once in a while, and South America can take adequate care of that deflation. But let's get into the story itself. You'll see more of this geography as we go along. Here we are then in front of the customs house in Buenaventura. The car still carries the terrible scars it received in Mexico and Central America, but it's still going, so we're eagerly ready for the Andes. How little we know what climbing them in a car really means. But we'll find out, don't you worry about that. We start immediately for Bogota, the capital, back up in the interior and about 9,000 feet in the air. On the way, we cross valleys, climb ridges, drop into deep canyons, pass under waterfalls, and begin to understand why Colombia is so famous for her varieties of agricultural products, climate, temperatures, and vegetation. It's a surprising experience to drive from the torrid zone to the Arctic Circle and back to tropic jungles again, all in a few hours. Yet that is exactly what you seem to do as you cross the three main ridges of the Andes, which fan up from the south across Colombia, cutting her alternately into cold, cloud-shrouded heights and the broad, lush valleys through which flow her big rivers. Colombians are very proud of their country and her products. We learn that when they begin telling us about Colombia-grown coffee. They think it's the finest in the world, and some experts agree with them. But that's what the Brazilians and the Costa Ricans say about their coffee, and the people in El Salvador. So we'll let these pictures represent them all and leave the argument as to which coffee is best to the experts who drink it and to those who grow it. On the tree, coffee looks like lovely red cherries, and that's exactly what it's called, coffee cherries. The tree grows best in deep shade at altitudes of 2,500 to 5,000 feet, and you see large acreages of it on sloping mountains and ridges as you drive along. After picking, the cherries are sent to the mill for hulling, processing, and drying. Each morning we were at the Alvarez Molino, we see the carts come in, loaded with sacks. The cherries are then dumped into these small cars and later into the huge vats of the mill. After several different processes which take off the cherry hulls and other coverings of the real coffee bean, the beans themselves are spread out on great patios to dry in the sun. When that process is completed, they're sucked all the way back to the mill again through this 6-inch suction pipe. Here, final cleaning is done to remove the bad beans, and the rest, full-bodied and full of flavor, are sacked for shipment to your table up here in the United States of America. Some of the more far-sighted of our Latin neighbor industrialists go to great lengths to provide high-standard working conditions for their employees. Here, for example, the De Sola family have provided a fine day nursery for babies of women working in their coffee beneficio. The mothers bring their babies in the mornings, pass them through a window to registered nurses, and go back across the street to work. 4 hours later, they come back again to nurse the youngsters, then cross the street once more and continue work. And so it goes. This woman nurses not only her own baby, but also this one belonging to her friend who died when the child was born. Sunbath time is really a circus. And if you don't think these Indian youngsters are cute, you should be around them for a few minutes. This young senorita doesn't like Yankee cameramen in the least. She was much more content with Don Juan Jr., whom you just saw. But pretty soon she gives up, like all good children, and is back in bed along with the rest to sleep out the wait until Mother's next appearance with something to eat. From Colombia, we finally enter Ecuador, and I think it fair to say we of the expedition probably would vote Ecuador as being the most interesting country through which we pass. Certainly we want no argument with anyone who feels otherwise, because the question, obviously, is open to debate. But we're captivated with the country, and this scene is a typical reason why. We find these men making tile for the roofs of their houses and stop to photograph the process. When we explain we want to show our countrymen in North America how our neighbors in South America live, the faces of these men break into broad grins, and from then on, we have only to tell them what we want them to do. As you've already seen, they let the bulls mix the mud by driving them round and round the center stake. When the mixture becomes sufficiently stiff and sticky, the fellows with a simple little frame and a big blob of the stuff proceed to make a tile. With the mud firmly packed in the frame, they next slide it off, very smooth indeed, onto this curved form. Then, to be sure it won't crack as it dries in the sun, the one chap sprinkles the ground with water while the other waits to place the thing in drying position. When everything is ready, he looks up at me, asks if I'm ready, then quickly pulls the form free, and there is a tile. And here is the boy who drives the bulls to mix the mud. He says to me, "But why do you want to take my picture, senor? I'm not so beautiful." Perhaps this scene, too, will help you understand why we like Ecuador. This cobblestone road is itself some 8,500 feet up, and look at the mountain peak behind it, thousands of feet higher. This is typical of the geography I mentioned. Right here, almost on the equator, are 3 peaks so high the snow on their summits never melts. And along the cobblestone roads at their feet come an unforgettable caravan of people, as colorful and interesting as any people in the world. Some of the fellows carry more on the inside than they do on the out, like the chap over on the left. These costumes, brilliantly patterned and colored, knee-length ponchos in sharp reds and blues, huge skin hats, and the people themselves, coming along, leading, carrying, or driving their livestock home from market, an indispensable activity in the lives of these colorful Americans. Once you see them along these high upland roads of the Andes, you'll never forget them. The next thing of great interest to us in Ecuador is the equator, the realization that we're actually at the middle of the earth, the place where north and south begins. We pull to a stop, of course, and spend a whole hour here enjoying ourselves like boys, wondering why the earth doesn't look different on the north side than on the south, reading the inscription on the monument plaque, tracing out latitude 0, 0, and 0, which we probably should not do, but which apparently many other people have done before us, so we see no harm in it. Then Arnold, always wanting to do things to remember, stands and grins with one foot on the north side of the earth and one on the south. And in back of him, you can easily see one of those great mountains of the equator, so high the snow on its summit never melts. And finally in Ecuador comes, I'm sure, the most memorable side trip of the expedition, a visit down into the Colorado Indian country of the Pacific Coast jungles. These people live, apparently, in family clans, with the father a sort of ruler over his children and in-laws. The fellow with the big stomach is a medicine man. For 3 days, his group has been in the throes of religious ritual, and he doesn't like the interruption of our arrival. How do you like these Don Juans? And their haircuts? We finally find another group not engaged in religious ceremony. With us is Andre Roosevelt. He said if we brought him along, he could entertain the Indians with sleight of hand tricks while we got pictures. So he entertains the Indians and I get the pictures. Here he shows them how to make a knot disappear from the tied corners of a handkerchief. It's a slick trick if you can do it. The knot is tied securely, checked, waved back and forth for hocus pocus, then checked again to be sure it's still there, but when the handkerchief is shaken, the knot has disappeared, and the old man doesn't know where. How do you like this for facial concentration? And again, those haircuts. Their hair is as black as the ace of spades, but it's plastered tight to their heads, cut straight off across their eyes, then painted that dripping blood red which they use on their bodies. The men, as you see, use the accessory color black, while the women use only the diagonal stripes of red. Here, Roosevelt shows them how to make a coin disappear, and the old man doesn't understand how Yankees can make money go so fast. I'm sure you'd like to know, too, where they get the paint which they use on their bodies. It comes from the seeds of the clustered pods which grow on the achiote tree, wild in the jungle. To get the seeds, the women go out, gather armloads of the pods, bring them in and stack them in their grass houses. Then about twice a week, they shell seeds for the family paint job. And when they finally have enough on this palm frond down on the ground, everybody gathers around to paint himself up. Taking a handful of the seeds, they spit in it. Then with their fingers, they begin crushing the seeds, mixing them with the saliva, and then on it goes. They keep themselves painted year in, year out, 24 hours of every day. This is why they're called Colorados, for Colorado in Spanish means red in English, and these people are red. It's difficult to get the women to smile, but now the lady seems to have found something to smile at, and I guess you can hardly blame her. And right here, I think I'd better say nothing, except perhaps to admit my face is plenty red when these women get through. I'm not even sure it's all paint. You know, it takes us 3 days to get that stuff off, and the last of it has to wear off. And so we head on south now toward Peru, with plenty to remember about Ecuador. But we're not through yet with memory, because on the way to Guayaquil, we pass majestic old Chimborazo, with his eternal poncho of snow draped about his broad head and shoulders. We'll have to remember him as a sort of exclamation point for all we've thought and said of Ecuador. Peru is something of a shock. Oh, we've been told of the great desert before, so we should be prepared. But after months of mountains and jungle, to come almost without warning, so to speak, out onto a floor of sand where not a stick of vegetation exists, needs almost to be described as shock. You see, on the north coast of the Gulf of Guayaquil is dense jungle and heavy rainfall, and on the south coast, barely 50 miles away, is desert where it never rains. And this desert stretches for some 3,000 miles south along the coast. As we drive along now, we come every few hours off the desert and into wide, fertile valleys where streams have started down out of the Andes, 75, 100, 150 miles away, and try to reach the Pacific through the sand. These valleys are all irrigated and constitute such a large total acreage, we're told, that agriculture is one of Peru's most important economies. Principal among the crops raised is sugar, and much of it finds its way into export. As with coffee, cacao, bananas, etc., sugar is raised in all the tropical Americas, so we represent them all with these sequences. There are many fine modern mills to be found along the way, yet a tremendous amount of sugar is produced by smaller independent operations. So picturesque and typical, we choose to show them instead of the larger, more mechanical operations. Here, for example, we see each morning this long line of bull carts heading out into the plantation, where a small army of cutters is at work. They cut the cane, strip the leaves from it, whack it into 4-foot lengths, and load it aboard their big wheeled carts, where it is to be hauled back to the mill and crushed, and the juice taken from it for the making of sugar. It is interesting as it can be to watch the fellows work. We follow them about, get in their way, joke with them, so we can get the natural, unposed shots we want. Take pictures of this operation and that. Close-ups of the men's faces as they work. Close-ups of the bulls to show how they pull by the yokes fastened to their horns. They have no harness as we know it. They pull simply by following the boy as he leads them, by laying his long driving stick across their yoke. Even the cart wheels intrigue us. These are solid 4-inch slices of a great mahogany tree. And always the men are friendly, cooperative, if a bit shy at times, and get a great bang out of these visiting Yankees from North America who poke their cameras and their noses into everything. Finally, back at the mill, the carts are wheeled up to this dark pit where the cane is thrown down and fed through the crusher. Later, the pummey, which is what we used to call it when I was a boy in old Mexico, is spread out on the ground to dry. And when that is done, it is brought back to the shed again to be used as fuel underneath the huge vats in which the juice is boiled in the preliminary stages of making sugar. As the stuff boils, it refines, and the men, steam swirling all around them, dip the waste from the top. When finally the sugar comes out of the centrifugal tanks inside the mill where I can't photograph it, the fellows carry it out in these big wooden boxes and dump it on this tiled platform where they dry it in the sun. I watch them with their hoes, rakes, shovels, and sometimes even their hands, and I finally ask the overseer if it's really good sugar. Huh, seguramente it's good sugar, he tells me with a big laugh. You taste it, senor, you find out. And so we all taste it, but especially Arnold. As we travel south now along the ocean, we come to a long ridge of sand about 400 feet high, so we stop to look it over. Arnold decides to climb it and begins zigzagging up across its face since it's much too steep to climb head-on, while Kenneth, really acting like a 10-year-old, amuses himself by writing our names in sand down at the bottom. But Arnold gives up reaching the top and starts back down. I call to him and say, "Come on, Arnold, run, show us some action, why don't you?" He yells back that if I think he's going to break his neck for my camera, I can think again. So he tries to keep himself under control as he comes down, but it isn't easy, for the face of that sand is steep. When finally he plops into it alongside Kenneth, he says to me, "If you're so brave and want somebody to run down, why don't you?" To which I retort, "Well, if you think I'm afraid, you're crazy." But I'm willing to admit now that Mr. Whitaker is not the man who is crazy. I go up as he did, zigzagging across the face of the ridge, and when finally I reach the top, I really put on the steam. I come over the crest of the thing at a hard run, and the instant I do, I know I've made a mistake. I can't stop. Arnold changes the camera to slow motion so you can see what's going on. But I assure you there is no slow motion going on inside my brain. I'm frightened to death. The speed of my run and the steepness of the sand make it impossible for me to control myself. I try time and again to stop, throwing myself at the sand. But instead of stopping, I roll over and over like something propelled sideways from a gun, come to my feet again with my tie flying and my clothes up around my neck choking me, and I lunge right on down the cliff. When finally I reach the bottom all in one piece, I'm a much humbler and a much wiser man. I finally pick myself up and start over toward the camera. Arnold calls out, "How do you feel, brave boy?" To which I reply, "Brother, I feel terrible." And he replies, "Well, brother, you certainly do look terrible." I'm no Colorado Indian, but what hair I've got is full of sand. And I do mean sand. And incidentally, the hair of my head is not all either. If I live to be 150 and do that many more expeditions, I promise you I shall never relax in this boyish fashion again. We followed the ocean all afternoon after that, hanging on the sides of the sand and rock-filled cliffs with the blue sea and the white breakers beneath us. I still can't quite recover from the effects of the sandhill, so I coax Arnold and Kenneth to stop early so we can sort of rest up. About 4 o'clock, we pull into this little sheltered spot between the rocks and pitch camp. We've done it like this 100 times before, of course. Unloading our equipment, setting up the beds, Arnold fussing with the car and the drop light, and Kenneth lighting the gasoline stove and beginning the evening meal. I told you in the first picture that we pull no punches in these two films. We do not purposely make ourselves look ridiculous, as I just did back at that sandhill, or even as I do here now, blowing up my air mattress. But what we do is what you might do under similar circumstances. So this is just by way of warning you a little. Our whiskered faces, our dirty clothes and hands, our methods of relaxation to relieve tension and get a new perspective on things so essential to our daily well-being, our way of eating, yes, and even the food we eat. Everything you see here is as real as the air you breathe, like the making of Old 77, for example, as Kenneth calls this stew. It's a specialty of his developed up in Mexico, where one night he surprised us by putting a huge panful of it in the center of the table, saying, "No use washing a lot of dishes every meal. It takes too much time and water's too hard to get. Besides, all your food goes to the same place anyhow. So boys, sit down and enjoy Old 77. And this is it. Boiling water, noodles, onion if you can get it, peas, corn, and string beans for vegetables, then salmon or corned beef or both for the meat course. It's all here, and we guarantee it for nourishment." Next morning, we're on our way again, heading south through more desert country toward Arequipa. Then suddenly we get a surprise. Almost as if we'd crossed a fence into an irrigated pasture, we enter a section where for perhaps half a mile or more, a thick carpet of flowers has spread itself over the sand. Delicate little flowers, looking like pansy-colored poppies. We can hardly believe our eyes. Then as suddenly as we entered it, we leave the flowered section and continue across the desolate country once more. It isn't until this happens several times that we learn that at certain seasons of the year, clouds drift in from the ocean through apparently fixed air channels and precipitate enough mist to allow the flowers to grow. Just one more of the fantastic extremes which seem so commonplace in South America. This great climb up from Arequipa is really something to behold as well as to experience. Up, 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 higher than we've ever been before in our lives on Earth. There seems to be no end to the climb or to the turns. 5,000, 8,000, 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 feet, and still we keep climbing. Our motor loses so much power in the rarefied atmosphere we wonder if we'll ever reach the top, but it keeps going. The water in our radiator boils much sooner than down at sea level, and we wonder if we brought along enough for replacement, and still we keep going up. Our ears begin to ring a bit, and our heads feel funny with the slightest exercise. We know by now we're up in the air. Then finally, at a point more than 1,000 feet higher than Pikes Peak in Colorado, we reach the pass and get out to look around. Walking is anything but brisk, but Arnold comes up to read the sign. Alto de Troya, 4,690 metros sobre el nivel del mar. And in case you want the English of that, it means this pass is somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,500 feet above the level of the sea, almost 3 miles straight up. Still not satisfied, Arnold and Kenneth get out the altimeter, and sure enough, that needle points to 4,690 meters. Now we're satisfied, or rather we will be when we get down again. Entering Bolivia at last, we come almost immediately to the shores of Lake Titicaca, highest navigable water in the world, 13,770 feet in elevation, 130 miles long and 1,000 feet deep. Along the water's edge, we see these large red-winged flamingos, as colorful and picturesque as the high country around them is drab and desolate. Also here on the lake, we find a family of Bolivia's Indians at work, planting, tilling their meager soil in the hope of harvest which will help them live. In costume, they're almost as colorful as the flamingos we just saw, and their voluminous clothing is wrapped closely around them to keep out the cold of the high, bleak country. We stop the car and come over to see what they're planting. Irish potatoes. Well, they should grow all right up here if the soil is any good, and around the lake it's probably much better than elsewhere in this desolate, rocky country. We watch with interest as the women drop the already sprouted tubers. Then the man comes along with his wooden plow and covers them up. But this appears almost prosperity compared to what we're to see now, because back here off the lake are the usual rocky farms of the humble people of the uplands. The llamas probably take your interest first, just as they always do ours. But now take a closer look at the rock fences and realize that all these rock have been picked by hand from the thin soil where a people are trying to grow a living. We always stop to watch the loaded llama herds pass. What curious-looking animals they are to us who are accustomed to motor trucks, horses, mules, and tractors to do our heavy work. But up in this high country, there are few roads over which such vehicles could travel even if they were available. As late as 1940, there were only 7,174 motor vehicles of all types in Bolivia, a country as large in area as Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and Missouri combined. And in those 7 states, there were more than 1,000 times that many registrations. Think that over for a moment. Also the fact that the only road out to the coast is the one we just came over, 16,000 feet in the air. And then you begin to realize what a gigantic handicap geography becomes to transportation and the national economy in Bolivia. Of course, this kind of pastime doesn't aid the country's economy much either. But if you tried walking these roads 14, 16,000 feet in the air, you'd probably be glad to lie down and take a nap too. Altitude does funny things to your ambition. Perhaps that's why the women carry the water and do so much of the work up here. Maybe they can stand the altitude better than the men. Down on the Pampa, we can't resist the temptation to chase guanacos with the car. We get in behind them and they head out across the Pampa with the ease and grace of shaggy antelopes. They never stop for fences. We see them go over barbed wire 6 feet high and never even pause for the leap. And when Arnold gets in behind them with the car, there really is plenty of action. We try also to come close enough to the roaming ostriches for pictures. But even with telephoto lenses, it's hard to approach near enough for a good shot. These fellows can run too, believe me, and they appear to have as little regard for fences as do the guanacos. And then we hit the mud. A good 1,000 miles of it, from Comodoro Rivadavia all the way to Magellan Straits. Normally, in the wintertime, this country is frozen solid. But this winter, July and August, it has just rained. For 5 weeks, we are told, every day, drizzle, drizzle, drizzle. This automobile met us at Mendoza and is to continue with us as a help and a guide all the way to Magellan Straits. And what a help it is. 6 times in one day, we back up to pull it once again up onto the road or out of the deep ruts in which it is stalled. I think that at no time on the entire trip have we been so discouraged and disheartened as we are here. I hope this scene begins to make you feel a little uncomfortable just for the sake of realism. With that fender off the car, we're blanketed with mud. It's impossible to keep it off. Day after incredible day, it's the same. Slip, slide, dig, and worry our way southward. Our clothes are damp and soggy with the constant drizzle. Our feet are soaked and freezing wet from wading in the mud and water. The weather isn't cold enough to freeze, just cold enough and wet enough to give us double pneumonia, and we all begin to feel as if we're contracting it. If we could just see the sun, it would help. But day after day goes by and it's just clouds and rain. We feel as if we're breathing cloud instead of air, and that adds to our discouragement and misery. But we're determined not to turn back. We've now come more than 15,000 miles, so we're not going to let a little mud stop us short of our goal. Then one morning the sun does come out for a few minutes, and Arnold's irrepressible spirits rise with the light. I'll be doggone if I'm going to drive a car I can't see out of, he grouses, and gets out and begins raking the mud off the back window. It's a good 2 inches thick. Then he gets back in, shakes his feet, closes the door, starts the car, and heads on south toward Magellan Straits, south and still farther south. And so at last we reach Magellan Straits and the central plaza of the city of Magallanes, where the townspeople give us a rousing welcome. We christen our car out on the end of the pier, fulfilling that pledge we made at the Panama Canal. And then, as guests of the Chilean Navy, on the little 125-foot ship Galvarino, we head south down through remarkably beautiful Beagle Channel toward Land's End and Cape Horn, our only remaining pledge still to be realized. We're gone 8 days, and during that time we're treated to a panorama of majesty and magnificence, the like of which must be unsurpassed anywhere in the world. Maybe that's an overstatement, but I find it hard to believe. For these cold mountains, the deep purple-blue channels, the high winds beating the seas and rock with ice and snow, the sudden bursts of sun, storm, or wind, all in a few minutes, all seem to me impossible of being surpassed. Then, without warning, on August the 19th, we come steaming out from behind Hall Island. Kenneth is down on deck. He lets out a yell. "Look," he exclaims, "Cape Horn, we're here." I ask the captain, and he nods, "Si, senor." Then we know we're really looking at Cape Horn, that famous rock toward which we've been struggling for more than 9 months and 16,000 miles. We begin slapping each other on the back in celebration, when suddenly we discover the honeymoon is over. Within 5 minutes, and I do mean 5 minutes, a storm blows up out of the southwest which turns that whole ocean into an angry sea of winds, sheets of water, and deep valleys of churning mill races. For over an hour the storm rages. The air is full of harsh sounds, the roar of the winds, the mountains of water breaking over the deck, the clanking of chains, the groaning of the boat, the shouts of the crew, and I guess the groaning inside of me. I'm no sailor, I admit it, but I have plenty of company today. Arnold, Kenneth, the first mate, 3 of the 5 dogs aboard, and several members of the crew. It's a characteristic Cape Horn storm put on, accommodatingly enough, it seems, that we might have a fitting climax for our story, a climax in some of the worst water in the world. Finally, as the storm lets up a little, we round the southern tip of the Horn. We coax the captain down on deck with us, and though we're still plenty wobbly, and the waves are still plenty bad for us, we shake hands around, and then, as a token of final victory, we throw our arms in the air and yell, "Hooray, hooray, we made Cape Horn."